Hello and welcome. I'm Psychic Medium Roberto, and I hope you're doing well today. In today's cold case episode, I will be looking at JonBenet Ramsey, who was 6 years old at the time of her murder, and the case is currently 26 years cold. And having done a couple of meditations on this already and starting to focus over the past couple of days, I've concluded that the title of this show should be The Truth is Stranger Than Fiction. Please feel free to engage by hitting the subscribe button and notifications icon. Alright, let's begin. Now, this case is widely known around the world and obviously made international headlines at the time during 1996. And we know that JonBenet was a budding little model, and her mom has also had experience in doing modeling and also won a serious competition as a winner in her state, I believe. But the influence and background with regards to modeling certainly was propelled by her mom, commonly known as Patsy. But the circumstances around this case, there's one fact, and that is this poor young girl, 6-year-old girl, was found murdered on December the 26th, or it was at least reported on December 26, 1996. And you know, when a community and even the world hears about a case like this, especially a murder of a young child, and that it occurred on Christmas Day, or was even reported on the following day, it just sends shivers down our spines, you know? That reminds me of a case here in South Africa with Oscar Pistorius and Reva Steenkamp, where Oscar brutally murdered his girlfriend on Valentine's Day, 2013. And of course, that tinged that celebration every year for quite a while, I would say. And yeah, we have the case where, Oscar shot his girlfriend 4 times at close range with a high powerful handgun. And of course, Reva didn't make that encounter, unfortunately. So the case in a nutshell, just for those who don't know the situation. So the family reported Patsy had called in and said her daughter was missing. And this was the day after Christmas. And of course, the police rushed over. There was a ransom note found. And quite bizarrely, in my opinion, that she was only discovered 8 hours later in the basement of her own home. And again, not to pass judgment or anything, but if I was a father, wake up one morning and my daughter's missing and there's a ransom note, I'm not just going to sit in a room or call the police. I'm going to look around the house and I'm going to make sure that she's actually is gone and not somewhere in the house. So personally, I find it very strange that they only discovered her 8 hours later. And this photograph here depicts, according to theory, that the perpetrator had infiltrated the house via this little manhole, if you like, had entered the house through this gate, in through the window there, and then went upstairs while everyone was sleeping, tried to kidnap JonBenet, and according to police, the perpetrator must have struggled to get her out the window there, and of course left her in the basement where, according to police, that she was of course brutally murdered. And I won't be showing too many graphic pictures. Brutally murdered, strangled, and there were other ligature marks or burn marks or marks on her body before she had died, and post-mortem as well. And according to police and forensic experts, that there was DNA samples left at the scene. Now we'll get into those DNA samples because this is where things take a bit of a turn, where this situation is stranger than fiction. And having meditated on the evidence itself, for example, I do believe that there is criminality within the evidence realm, let's call it that. And in my opinion, I believe this whole situation here in the basement was staged. And we will get into that a bit later. So I'm going to start the reading by looking at the mother and daughter combination. and I've just loosely called it the tale of the two princesses. As mentioned earlier, the mom had also been involved in pageantry, was a model, and was familiar with that environment, and of course would be a good coach then for JonBenet going through the system. And Patsy would obviously give her a guiding hand, control her, manage her, and get her through the pageants and prepare her for the pageants. So let's have a look. Who was JonBenet Patricia Ramsey? She was obviously 6 years old at the time when she died. I would say this was a very outgoing type person. She was kind of a very physical person. So in other words, doing pageants, she would love to dance, sing. That is in her date of birth. She was definitely outgoing, family-orientated, community. And however, I do believe personally that although she was winning awards and being the top model and being very successful as a young child doing this thing, I don't believe that if we had to forward her by 5 to 10 years or even 10 years from that age, even further, early 20s, I don't think she would have carried on with this. Even if she had the looks and the personality, I don't believe this was her forte. I believe she would have been molded, groomed, and of course, you know, her mom, having done these kind of things, would have wanted this and living the dream through her daughter. But I think ultimately, I don't think she actually enjoyed it. I don't believe that it was a natural situation for JonBenet, and I would believe that she would struggle with this kind of thing personally, like inner self. She would struggle with it, and ultimately, you know, she is being guided by her mom and dad, so she would obviously have to, you know, listen to what they have to say. But ultimately, I don't believe this was her thing. It would have felt almost awkward, is the word I've been given now, is awkward. Now, if we look at her mom, commonly known as Patsy, her full name Patricia Ann Pog, excuse the pronunciation, Ramsey, and she was 39 at the time of JonBenet's murder. And you must realize as well, this woman was also going through her own struggles. She was already suffering from ovarian cancer, which she would struggle for many years, and would obviously be overcome by ovarian cancer later in 2006. She was definitely an outgoing person that we can see in the 29. She was definitely out there, full of ideas. Of course, she would want the best for her daughter, but she was also feeding her own dreams and goals. And, you know, maybe she didn't become Miss USA, so she was hoping perhaps that JonBenet would fulfill that part of her dream. You know, parents do like to live through their kids, and there's nothing wrong with that. When it becomes an issue is when the parents push too far, and I believe in the case of JonBenet, that was definitely not a natural fit for her. Being around the pageants was great for her. She would be the queen mom, you know, because JonBenet was obviously very popular. Patricia was also very controlling, very, very controlling. And she was in a controlling time of her life as well at the time of the murder. Very domineering, very controlling. And I would say she was also prone to outbursts, throwing her toys out the cot, as it were. She would have loud outbursts. It's all about me. Why is this happening to me? You know, she would be all about herself, effectively. And she would also encounter much difficulties in her life that we see in the 5. So that controlling element we see in the 3. We see the difficulties that she would have encountered in her life, the 5, and that could be related to her health and illness. And that 8 is also very aggressive, loud, and would get throw, let's say, temper tantrums. Very manipulative, controlling type person, wants to be in full control of the situation, and if she didn't get her way, there would be sparks flying. Now, I must admit, each time I was preparing these slides over the last couple of days and just focusing on this case, and when I kept on getting to this guy, John, the father, I must say, guys, and I don't mean to be rude or anything, but this guy gives me the creeps. Very controlling, very manipulative, all about himself, full control, and we see that in the 3. At the time of the murder, he was 53, which equals an 8. And we're starting to pick up similar numbers between the three people, and I will show a comparative slide so we can have a look at that. And being born on the 7th, he was outgoing, trains, planes, automobiles, a lot of engineering around him. And of course, we know in the background he was involved with a large military company. And just prior to the year of JonBenet getting murdered, he was involved in a big business takeover worth, I believe, $1 billion in 1996. In those days, that would have been like $10 billion today, for example. It was huge. It was massive. So JonBenet Ramsey was certainly connected in the business world. He had various serious connections in the military and operational manufacturing, as well as engineering. I would say is kind of a kingpin in the community. And this guy had just landed a big deal. Now, in his numbers, we also have control in the 3. The number 1 is about entrepreneurship, individuality, all about him. It's what he wants to do. Very controlling man, this. And I promise you, each time I was going through these slides, I would just feel this guy gives me the creeps. That's all I can say. And that 9 is very also big ideas, bright ideas, but also there lurks a very dark side behind that number 9. Now, if we look at them comparatively, this is quite a bit of a lengthy hold on this picture. So we've noticed in the 3 of them is the key numbers that I mentioned in the previous slide. Now, if we look at the 8 in JonBenet, the 3 in Patricia, and 3 in John. Now those 3s, let's look at the positive side as well. Of course, we know the outcome of this case is not positive, it is negative, so I will be looking mainly at the negative aspects of these numbers. But let's say from a positive point of view, that 3 can also mean community, creativity, bringing people together, family. But if we look at the dark side of that number, or the bad side, control, 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 and we had it both in the mother and in the father. Okay, and within JonBenet, the 8 is all about performance, communication, dancing on stage at her age. Let's focus on her age. That, she was out there. She was doing singing, dancing, all kind of routines during her pageantry, right? So already we see 2 3s, so there's a definite connection there with the parents, right? So that second number, the 5, is all about the outcome in their day. Those are their outcome numbers for the day, right? So as mentioned with JonBenet, a lot of difficulty in that 5. She wouldn't be comfortable what she was doing in the day, doing all the pageantries and that kind of thing. And we see the same in Patsy, right? And those 5s, if we look at it from a negative point of view, or not a negative point of view, but the bad side of a 5, a lot of abuse, a lot of deceit, a lot of deception, unnecessary bumping of heads. And when we see that both in the mom and the daughter, I would say that these guys, the 2 of them, there would be quite a lot of conflict with them. There would be a lot of emotions and control and outbursts between the 2 of them. And of course, especially with JonBenet being so young, the outcome with that blue 6 is she would be more passive. She would accept that her mom is right, and she would do what her parents tell her. Now, let me tell you, that 6 as an adult would be completely different. It would be a disconnect. Tell them to stuff off. Don't tell me what to keep doing. Don't tell me what to do. I will do what I want to do. Now, when you're a child of that age, it becomes the opposite. You become passive, compliant. You're doing what you don't want to do because you get told you have to do it. And that would be very strong from her mom with that blue 8. So in those 2, we see a lot of conflicts already. That there would have been a lot of head banging during the day. There would be a lot of shouting. Her mom would be very controlling. JonBenet would have to be passive. But the outcome for those guys is her mom was the aggressor, the adult, and the child was the passive person in the relationship. And again, I'll just be shown to say again that had JonBenet been older, that would have been a very different situation. You would even find that JonBenet, had she been in her 20s, would have realized the type of parents that she has. And I'm just saying the type of parents she has in conjunction with who she was wouldn't necessarily fit what the parents wanted for her. She would have definitely been a standalone, standout individual. And when I did further, when I was going into this much deeper early on, having had looked at this a few times, I would definitely say that there was a fair amount of disconnect between JonBenet and her parents, ultimately. Okay. Now, if we look at the father, also very controlling with a 3, as I mentioned before. That 1 is all about individuality, and that 9, I would say that John, the father, was obviously very focused on his business activities and would leave Patsy to do all the work around the house and with the kids. But of course, he would have a say in it, being the father, being controlling, all about money, himself, business, the company. But again, and I'm pointing out again that number 9 in the father certainly has a dark side. And I believe that dark side is going to come into play later. When we look at these 3 and the day in which this crime had happened on the 25th of December, you will see there 3, the red 3, the number 1, and the number 8. Right? Now, what's always bothered me, having reviewed this over the past few days, is that the 25th of December, when I believe that the murder took place during that evening into the next morning, essentially, at the core, JonBenet doesn't really feature in that. So this was about something happening to her. She certainly had no control over it. And I know this sounds obvious, but looking at these numbers and the feeling that I'm getting around this case and the image that I've been showing is she was not involved in this. In other words, whatever happened to her was being done to her and not vice versa. And I know that sounds strange, but just hear me out here. This was a crime perpetrated on her, and she had no control over the situation whatsoever. I guess what I'm getting to say is, because of her pageantry and because of what she did as a young model, obviously that creates a lot of threats in terms of pedophiles, stalkers, and that kind of thing, right? But her murder had nothing to do with who she was and what she was doing. Now, the reason why I say that, look at December 25th, 1996 and December 26th, 1996. There is not one single 6 in those numbers. And the key numbers for JonBenet, she was a number 6 life path. Patsy was a number 8 life path. And John was a number 9 life path. This was all perpetrated against JonBenet, and not because of her being a model or what she was doing. On the day of the 25th, there was control, the number 3, and we see that number in Patsy, and we see that number in John. There is the number 1, where we see that in John's number 1. We also see the number 8, which would be the final outburst and aggression and violence perpetrated against JonBenet. And those 2 7s all speak about crime and injustice. And we see later developed numbers. We see that number 7 in John's numbers and less of an impact in Patsy's numbers. Okay? Now, if we go to the following day, the 26th, so this is when the following morning, Patsy calls up and says, my daughter's missing. She's been kidnapped. We found a ransom note. Now, again, we see the number 3. So we see the parents. We see the 2, that is coming together of ideas, coming together of a plan. And this is how we're going to deal with this situation. And the lead person there would be the person with a number 9, and that would be John. And the situation on the previous day, the situation was influenced by Patsy. Now, that UN7 and the UN9 and the UN8, those what I call universal numbers. If we look at all the numbers involved in each person, they each get a number. It's not their life path number. I'm just calling it a universal number. JonBenet is a number 7, Patsy is a number 9, and John is a number 8. And we see those numbers present in the first day. Let's say the 25th of December. We see the 7s there, personal number 7. That was a personal impact on JonBenet. The 9 we see in the second day, and the 8 we see in the first day. This family was involved in the murder of JonBenet. I believe there was no perpetrator. I believe the stage scene was staged. And then it begs the question, how did that DNA evidence get onto the clothes of JonBenet, and whose DNA was that? And also, how was that DNA obtained to place on JonBenet's clothing? Right? This was orchestrated. So I believe the initial issue, and that is JonBenet being murdered, was confined within the walls of the house, but I want to say was confined between the parents. This was a crime perpetrated on a young girl by her parents in lesser or greater ways. There would have been a conflict. If I look back from the 22nd of December, there was already difficulties within the home that would have impacted, so this is 22 December, would have already impacted JonBenet, Patricia, and not so much John. I would say John was still out there doing business or wrapping up the year, as it were, but I don't think he would have been completely impacted. I would say there was an ongoing thing going on between JonBenet and her mom. And when we get to the 23rd of December, I would believe there would have been some kind of outburst or rage that would have impacted both parents, but mostly Patsy and JonBenet. However, and this would start irking John on December the 23rd. Okay? And I would definitely say during this time and in the history of this family, there was abuse, there was control, and there definitely was abuse. And I would go on to say the 24th of December, this would have impacted JonBenet more. In fact, I really feel like that there are more numbers on December the 24th for JonBenet than there is on December the 25th. So there's definitely a cloud of deceit and deception around this case already. I believe there was an impact on JonBenet that day before Christmas, and I'm even going to go as far as to say that I believe there could have been molestation, there could have been abuse, physical abuse, perpetrated by the parents. So what bothers me, and has been bothering me for the last day or so, or 2 days, let's say, as mentioned earlier, that I'm not seeing JonBenet on the December the 25th. There's a very sneaky suspicion that she was already dead on September, that she was already dead on the 24th of December. I'm picking up very little vibration or information around December the 25th. Something was wrong here. Something was very wrong here. Now, I read some reports, and I don't want to go too much into it. I know the family went away, and they came back Christmas night, and then the next day they discovered her. Something doesn't add up here. Now, remember, alibis could be made, situations can be changed when you have higher powers, even county level government officials. You have big business influencing local authorities. This was all in play here. So that when we get to the 25th of December, I'm definitely seeing the big issues around here. Huh? I'm definitely picking up big issues here. Something happened that triggered off the murder within the family. And I believe the initial cause of death, in my opinion, and having seen this image and felt what I was feeling, in fact, it happened yesterday as well, that I felt like I was being suffocated. So in other words, I believe JonBenet was actually suffocated, not strangled as the outcome of the crime scene. Okay, so just bear with me here. I believe she was, and then the crime scene was staged. So there would have been an interaction between the parents. What the hell has just happened? What is going on? What have you done? Something happened. Okay. Now, a very abusive environment. I believe there was molestation involved. And I believe JonBenet was actually smothered to death. And the reason that she was smothered to death was that the secret of her being molested continuously, or at least for a period of time, would not come out. Now remember, JonBenet was a vocal person in the 8 and in the 6. She would have spoken up about this. She would have at some point just said, enough is enough of this control, abuse, enough is enough. And she was snuffed out, I believe, by her father. And then the cover-up happened. Now remember at the time, and I'm seeing this again, and you guys remember the movie Pulp Fiction, where the two main characters accidentally kill this character in the back of the car, and they call Mr. Wolf to come and fix it. I believe in this case there was a Mr. Wolf. I believe in this case there was a Mr. Wolf that was called in. Now remember, John Ramsey was very connected in the community. He was a high-standing citizen, had a lot of influence with local authority as well as the military. A Mr. Wolf was called in, and a discussion was had around the situation, because obviously a big billion-dollar deal had just gone through, and this was bad for business. And a Mr. Wolf was called in and set up the crime scene. Now the question begs, how did they obtain the DNA samples that were on JonBenet's clothing? And who did that DNA belong to? Now, I will put my neck on the line and say the outcome of that DNA, yes, obviously there is a male attached to that DNA because it belongs to someone in the first place. But that person will either be classed as a vagrant or died X amount of years ago or whatever. That DNA was staged, was placed on that crime scene. And that whole crime scene, I believe, was staged. There were a lot of red herrings, I believe, in the case. One of them being that burn mark on the hand, which I'll get to a bit later. And I believe that ransom note was a red herring as well, placed there to confuse authorities, placed there to create or draw attention away from the family. And I believe this whole situation was staged based on an inter-family situation that got out of control. People found out, people were making a noise about the situation with JonBenet, and the situation unraveled into the murder of this young kid, and it was covered up by big friends of Mr. John Ramsey. So I find it very interesting that after, 26 years, how does a case take cold for 26 years when all the people involved were in that house. This was a cover-up, I believe. Now, I did a test actually before this reading, about 2 hours before I started recording this reading. I received another image of the criminality around this case, and the evidence was there's definitely criminal elements around this crime scene. And I'm not saying the crime itself, but with the evidence itself, there was criminality around the evidence. Evidence was placed, staged, and gathered that is not true or related to this case at all. Now, imagine these two parents, and we see Patsy here holding the reward. I mean, that's a hefty reward, you know. And I guess John Ramsey felt secure in that no one would ever claim that reward, right? $100,000 in 1996, that was huge money. Those two there, the couple there, know exactly what happened to her daughter. They know exactly what happened to their daughter, and each were involved in some way or form, whether as the perpetrator or part of the cover-up. And it really, you know, at the end of the day, yeah, we have a young girl who was enjoying life, forced to do things that she didn't want to do, whether it was on stage or in the bedroom. And yeah, it's really sad when a young girl like this, 6 years old, murdered within her home. And yeah, you know, we just look at these parents. What happened that night? And the cover-up, you know, you must remember, John had a lot to lose. The family had a lot to lose. He had just secured a $1 billion big deal being bought out. There was big money being toyed around. There were big names involved. And unfortunately, the ultimate outcome was that the fact remains is that JonBenet, a 6-year-old girl, or suffocated or murdered within her home. And I believe the incident started in her bedroom, but was staged in the basement. I do believe that the incident began in the bedroom. You know, I do get a sense that Patsy walked in on the situation, and she could have also lost her cool. There was, yeah, big, disgusting revelation that day. And it reminds me of the case as well, again, with Madeleine McCain, that the parents ultimately know what happened. And with in the case of Madeleine McCain, with the guy in Germany sitting in jail, has been pointed out as the perpetrator. I don't believe that's the case at all. The parents know exactly what happened. And funny enough, well, as I started doing the reading, I did receive a message from, I believe, JonBenet Ramsey, that she misses her brother. At the end of the day, these cases are not nice. You know, especially when you have a young child that is murdered, had no control over the situation. And I know that keeps sounding, of course not, she was only 6, but I see it in those numbers as well. She had no control over the situation, all perpetrated from the adults within the home, whether as the main perpetrator or accomplice. But the most sickening thing as well is that the crime scene was staged. And I don't believe that an adult man could have fit properly through those grills and the window and go upstairs, put her in a suitcase and bring her out. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. I do believe there was a Mr. Wolf on the scene who would have been contacted to come in and remedy the situation, draw attention away from the parents, and this was a big cover-up. Thank you for watching. Please leave your comments and suggestions below. I would love to hear from you. And I will see you in the next one. Stay safe and stay alert.